On today's Impactful Writing podcast, Writing and Storytelling Lessons from 2020. I'm Jay Sherer. He's Caleb Monroe. And this is the Impactful Writing podcast. What was the first lesson you learned in 2020 about writing and about storytelling?
What I learned is that writing was both kind of the hero and the villain of my year, as far as the ups and the downs. Both, a huge percentage of them came out of my writing life. And that was something that I came to realize in December as I sort of looked back on the year. But then this year I tried something new. It's something I picked up from Tim Ferriss, and he's been doing this for 5 years or so, or at least he's been talking about doing it for 5 years. And instead of setting goals for the new year, he does a past year review where he goes through his calendar and everything he did in the previous year and jots down the things that had a positive impact, the people, the activities, the commitments, and the ones that had a negative impact. Then he tries to eliminate the 20% of the most negative, and then he tries to the 20% of the positives that had the best impact on his year, he tries to put on his schedule for the coming year and to lean more into those. So I thought that was an interesting approach, and I spent this past week doing it, and it confirmed that. I'll share some more lessons in a little bit, but it confirmed that writing was both leading the pack in positives and negatives.
Mine is sort of similar. The impact that storytelling has is really, truly immense. And what I mean by that is, in 2020, a lot of people started to believe a lot of different things. And I have friends who, whether they were on, if they were, leaning left or leaning right, or if they were, farther right or farther left, whichever side of the spectrum that they were on, stories impacted their life in really, really, really critical ways. So in order for a story to work, you have to believe the story, right? Like, in order for anything to work, it has to be believable to you. The characters have to be characters that you would feel like you would see in real life. It has to align somewhat with challenging the way that you have previously believed, I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, it can just entertain you and it can just be escapism. But if it's really having an impact on you, then it has this way of getting into your brain and almost like rewiring the way that your brain works in a lot of ways. And I was really shocked at the impact that the storytelling had on the general populace in 2020, because I will talk to a lot of my friends now, and not only have their beliefs shifted throughout the course of 2020, but they've become more solidified. They have become, and I'm talking about, so when I say storytelling, I'm not necessarily saying they went to see a Marvel movie and it changed their life. But what I'm saying is their brains were rewired to think about stories in a way that I don't think that they had previously thought about them. So whether it was, wow, I now believe a lot of the conspiracy theories are true because I saw this thing on Jeffrey Epstein, and then we saw what happened to Jeffrey Epstein. And a lot of that is information that you don't have a full grasp of, right? However, what the brain is so powerful to do is create a story around it. Now, I'm not saying that those stories are false. I'm not saying that those stories are true. Because again, you can look at the spectrum of stories and everybody believes something different. But what it does to me is it tells me that when people believe the stories and then I have a conversation with them, they've begun to actually act on them. They've changed their behavior and their thought patterns because of the stories and because of what they choose to believe. And I say choose because belief is a choice. I don't think a lot of things when I talk to somebody, I'm like, you believe that? And they go, yeah, I believe that. And I go, okay, well, you're choosing to believe that, but I'm not choosing to believe that. So I don't think it works that way. And by the way, neither of us can prove the other one wrong, right? It's like an atheist having a conversation with a person of faith who believes in God of any religion. You could be like, well, I believe in God. And I go, I don't believe in God. Okay, there's evidence you could probably present evidence on both sides of that equation that backs up what story you're choosing to believe. And the impact of that, to the point where, we saw in late December, what you believe in terms of stories is going to have you act. right? It's going to have you act as you go protest, you go to, storm the Capitol building. These are stories that you have believed and internalized. I'm not saying they're false. I'm not saying they're false. Because we saw BLM, we saw politics, we saw whatever side of the aisle you're on. But those stories are things that people chose to believe and not. And we saw that in the fake news, and we saw that in the, false information. And so what it does to me, what it tells me, I'll just stop by saying what the lesson is. The lesson is that I have to be as responsible as possible in order to tell stories, because I don't want to create any situations where I am being irresponsible and causing people to believe and then behave in some different way. And that was kind of shocking to me that we got there so quickly.
Yeah, I think you're right in that part of what 2020 helped reveal, this was always true because this is how human brains work, but part of what 2020 helped reveal is how much behavior is affected by the narrative that you believe you're a part of, or the story that you're telling yourself. Before 2020, I think a lot of that was internalized and subconscious. We weren't making a lot of connections between the narrative we thought we were in and our actions. But I think 2020 really showed how much our actions and our activity in the world is influenced by the story that we think we're part of. This is probably the most writing specific of the things that I learned from last year. But towards the end of the year, as I was sort of reflecting back on the year, writing wise, as a writer, and as I was traveling in December, I was thinking about the previous year, and I felt disappointed. I felt like I had done a lot less than I wanted to do. I felt like I hadn't gotten much done, things like that. But then in these past couple of weeks, as I went through what I actually did and listed them, I was really surprised by how much I got done and how many of them I had forgotten. It was only when I went through my journal and my calendar that I remembered, oh yeah. So I'll just tell you some of the things. So I wrote over 20,000 words of a book. Nice. I assembled 3,600 pages of notes toward another thing that I'm hoping to write one day.
3,600?
Yes. Those are notes I've taken over the past 15 years, but I finally assembled, got them together into some order. I made 96 magazine submissions with short stories and received 96 rejections. I wrote and rewrote 13 20-minute video scripts. I wrote 13 new comic series pitches and sent those off to a publisher. I wrote 7 short stories, began several others. I wrote 3 film treatments. I revived 2 dormant comics projects. I wrote a short comic pitch, a short comic script, and I polished a TV pilot. And that's a pretty, the idealistic side of me would love for that list to be longer. But when I look at that list, I'm satisfied. But I wasn't satisfied when I just thought through it. I had to actually make the list of everything that I had done. And the human brain has a negativity bias, which means that we remember the negative parts of something more than we remember the positive parts of something. Physically, we remember the negatives better. And that's a survival trait, so that you remember, oh yes, that berry made me sick. And it's important that you remember that more than the berry that didn't make you sick.
Don't touch the pill.
So, right? So when we look at our own lives, our memories skew negative. And so when I was just thinking back over 2020, I was disappointed and I had a negative view on what I had accomplished. But then when I listed it out, I actually felt productive and pretty positive. And I was kind of laughing at myself, like, how did I forget that I did that thing? Like, that's not a small thing. And I just totally forgot that I did it. The 20,000 words on a book that I did, I really forgot that I did that because it was early in the year. And, that's nothing to sneeze at.
Not at all. Yeah. I think that it's really positive, and this is maybe this is a lesson that I am still learning. I think you've learned this lesson better based on the conversations that we've had. But I think it's really, really positive to celebrate the work that you have done. My next one piggybacks on my first one. So my first one being the impact of storytelling, and more so than that, how the human brain is wired to. Stories can sort of, I think, push you in a direction, but the brain has to accept and believe in the direction that the story is prompting you. And it has to fill in information, because there is not as much information about life as we would like there to be. Just think about it from writing. Just think about writing a story about an event that happens, and then think about writing it from multiple different character perspectives. Right? This person's point of view, this person's point of view, this other person's point of view. Each one of those people will likely see the events unfold differently in some way, shape, or form, because they're going to put emotions on top of what happened. They didn't notice some of the things that other people noticed. They were not prompted by some of the things that happened. So I bring that up because even if you think you have all of the information, you may only have one perspective actually on how the information played itself out. And since none of us have this, omnipresent drone that just flies over situations and sees every single angle and sees every single piece of detail as it unfolds, it's very difficult for us. So anyways, what I'm trying to say is the brain has to participate in order to believe something, in order to say, like, that's a story and I believe that story. The brain has to participate. And that's sort of what I was saying in the first example. But the second lesson is the audience's state of mind has a lot to do with what they will choose to believe or not to believe. And that is something that I have always not given enough credibility or credence to, because especially as somebody who, we called this the Impactful Writing Podcast because you and I want to have an impact, right? Like, and I think most writers do. And if we want to have an impact, then we need to know where our audience is at before we start telling the story to them. Because if we start telling certain stories, they're going to be like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And so I bring that up because we've had an increasingly polarized last decade. And over the course of this little tiny polarization, we started to collect information from different sources. And there's a plethora of information now available to us. There's a plethora of stories now available to us. We can choose to escape and go to comic books. We can choose to escape and go to, independent films. And there's just lots of places for us to collect stories, whether they're real life stories or whether they're, just fanciful stories. But I did not expect that in 2020, once we saw the impact of the pandemic, I did not anticipate what isolation would do to people's brains. If you would have told me that isolation would cause people to start to invest in stories in different ways, I would have said that makes a ton of sense to me. But the practical application of it I didn't understand that would happen as much. I did not find that even myself, by the way, I'm pointing the finger at myself and all this stuff too. I did not realize that I would start to go, oh man, my friends who are choosing to have parties during the pandemic, I don't think they care about me anymore. Now, granted, they didn't tell me they didn't care about me. I interpreted that they didn't care about me because, I've talked about this before, but if my wife is in a vulnerable population and we have to keep it locked up and you have parties, I can't see you. So you must not care about seeing me if you're going to have parties, right? These are the kinds of things that would go through my mind. Isolation will start to have us tell ourselves stories because, again, we're only seeing one piece of information and our brain is filling in the rest. And so I think how do I internalize that to storytelling? I think that it means that if you want people to follow what you're trying to say in your story or in your writing, you need to have the breadcrumbs laid out in such a way and know where your audience mind is when they start to invest in the story, so that when their brain engages with the story and when their brain starts to follow a thought pattern, it goes in the right direction. And I saw this a lot of times with the Story Geeks podcast. We'd get together for the Story Geeks podcast, and someone would say, "Oh, this movie that we watched together, I really feel it was saying this." And I was like, how did you get there? Because I watched the same movie and I thought it was saying this, this, and this, and I can point to the evidence of this, this, and this. And they go, "Well, what about this other evidence of this, this, and this?" And then we have this long discussion about what the movie was actually trying to say, what the movie was actually trying to impart to those audience members who are participating in it. And I think that the audience's state of mind, you can't control that. It's not a variable of your story you can control. Which means that ultimately, when they put down your book or when they turn off their TV, you cannot control what went on. You can only influence, right? You can only influence what went on in their brains. You cannot control it, and that to me speaks to the importance of for storytellers and writers to go back to the premise, go back to your concept, go back to the little details that you have included in the story. Have you included details that make people start to believe something that at the end of the story you'd think would be horrible if they believed? Just check those things. You're not going to be able to control it 100%, but checking those things is really, really important based on where the audience is showing up to your story.
My next thing, and this is putting on, I guess, my reader or viewer hat, is there were only two things that had more positives in 2020 for me than writing. The very first one was social stuff, just conversations with friends, experiences with people, or my wife and I, our apartment flooded. So we spent the first 9 months of the year living with friends, and just like family dinners and things like that were just those were positive experiences. So that was my number one source of positive experiences. But the second most, and they overlapped because so many of these were both, was movies or books or TV shows that I just really enjoyed. And so many of those were done with people, like after family dinner, we would go watch a movie or something like that.
Yeah.
And so that also brings home to me the fact that writing doesn't go out into a vacuum. You can't control what happens, but you can have tangible effects on people's lives. You can make a bad day a good day. You can, you know what I mean? Things like that. And I don't think there's a craft lesson there so much as a mindset lesson, but just to think back on all of the positive experiences that you have had in the past year, movies that you just loved. It was just so exciting to watch them, or a documentary about a shared experience that you were able to really connect with someone over, things like that. Just think back on all of that, and it really informs your mindset about the fact that in some ways it's an ethereal art form. Yes, it has less and less tangible forms as we move forward in technology, but it can have tangible emotional, spiritual, psychological effects on people. Can make a day a good day, a day that gets remembered on a list of positive things at the end of the year, for me. So, and part of that too is just I'm wired that way. I love stories, which is why I want to tell them. So, not everyone's going to have that same level of positive experiences just from a story that they watched by themselves, but it still happens to all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. In fact, I'm going to switch. I had mine ordered separately, but just to piggyback off of yours, when you talk about being social and participating in storytelling, whether you're watching or whether you're doing what I have on mine, which is collaborating with other people to tell a story or to get better at it, right? Some of the best experiences I had, I should say, in 2020 were when I was collaborating with somebody, whether it was us on this podcast, whether it was me, now these days I'm kind of a guest on the Story Geeks podcast because I'm not on that podcast as much, or whether it was collaborating with my writing partner and storytelling partner, Nathan. We had a storytelling brain trust meeting at the beginning of 2020. Of course, everything changed after that meeting, but that was, to be able to converse with people about both the process of storytelling, but also the stories, like you said, that we see around us. Those types of conversations are really impactful to me because it allows for nuance to take place in what I'm believing and what I'm investing in and why I was put on this earth and what purpose does my existence have and what's important about my existence. And so I would say collaboration, and that is collaboration in trying to figure out what's true, collaboration in trying to figure out what stories were the best things that we saw this year and what we're really excited about, collaboration in saying, what was great about this story and what could have been improved, collaboration in the actual telling of the story itself. That was really, that's always a really, really high point for me too. So similar to yours, just slightly nuanced differently, but collaboration was big.
As I looked at all the things that I got done, I also listed sort of the writing adjacent things in my life. And so that includes the movie coming out. That includes this podcast. That includes getting some artists attached to comics projects, but that's a whole separate thing than me actually writing the scripts.
Right.
And it includes writing related education. So when I looked back at 2020, I realized that I completed a screenwriting mentorship. I attended an in-person workshop in February before the world shut down. I attended a virtual workshop, and then I did 10 online workshops somewhere in that neighborhood. I joined 2 writing groups.
Nice.
And what I realized is that those spaces, the writing related education spaces, where I'm trying to make my craft better, they also contributed hugely to my productivity. Many of those stories were written for an assignment for a workshop or because I needed something to turn in, and so if I hadn't been in these workshops or in these writing groups or in this mentorship program, if I hadn't sought those things out and made them part of my life, then that list of things that I wrote last year would have been maybe half as long, because so much of it was done for the sake of that, for the sake of developing my craft, but also for the sake of community. I guess where you were saying collaboration, I think conversation. Just the fact that I needed something to say in those spaces. I needed something for someone to respond to. And yes. And then this podcast, which is a little different, but similar in that this is a dedicated space where every 2 weeks, I get to try to clarify something about writing that is probably not clarified in my brain yet, and that I think has also contributed to my growth as a writer, and also has made me want to, we talk about something and then I want to go try it, and so that also spurs the productivity. So I think the final lesson that I learned was that put yourself in these education conversational spaces, because they will lead to productivity. So I guess my recommendation for people, the action item is find a writing group. If you don't have one, look for workshops. If you haven't done any, there's a lot of good free ones. There's a lot of good cheap ones. There's plenty that you can pay substantially for as well. But put yourself into those spaces, because they will make you have to create stuff and make you have to clarify your thinking on things.
My 4th lesson was the importance of, you can call this being adaptable. You can call it having a backup plan. You can call it, whatever you will. I kind of lucked into my backup plan because, as Caleb mentioned, we released a full cast audiobook. We had on the Reclamation Society, which is the production company that Nathan and I operate. It's a nonprofit, so nobody owns it. But the nonprofit production company that we operate, we had a goal. Our vision on our books was to, by 2025, have a feature film. And 2020 really showed that we, as a production company, were probably focused on the wrong things. Because we constantly fight this battle of, should we be a storytelling company and then work with other production companies to sort of make sure that we tell the right stories, or do we go full production company and control everything? And what became very apparent to us in 2020 was that as these stacks and stacks of projects in Hollywood are occurring, it's going to be, I think, this is just my personal assessment, especially for people who have not been of experience in Hollywood, which we don't, it's going to be harder and harder to not create independent films, but get into big budget production schedules, because everybody has shifted their production schedule back. So it's not to say your movie won't get made, but chances are, unless it's like something completely mind-blowing, it won't get to the front of that pile, right? Like they'll go through all of the other ones that they have in their hopper of products. And I'm not saying you shouldn't write film. I'm not saying you shouldn't do any of that kind of stuff. I'm just saying having a backup plan that says, well, if I can't get through a traditional storytelling source, what's my backup plan? Because I still have to tell stories, right? So if you can't do movies, are you going to do full cast audiobooks? That's what we're going to do, right? We're going to say, hey, look, let's not concentrate on the short films, and let's not concentrate on the feature film aspects of the Reclamation Society. Let's instead focus our efforts on something that not as many people are doing. Let's instead focus our efforts on something that we're ahead of the game because we've done something that other people have not done yet. And what if we just make our plan to do more of that and to get better at that and to like shrink our vision instead of, because we'll expand the vision one day, but and we'll talk about this as this may be a good transition into goal setting, but having a vision doesn't mean you have to have like, here's my 5-year vision, and if I can't achieve that, then it's no good. Have a 1-year vision, a 3-year vision, a 5-year vision, a 10-year vision, and then understand how to work towards and adapt towards what you're trying to aim for. I think it's really important. So having the ability to, as a writer, to figure out how you're going to adapt to still be able to do what you are called to do in terms of telling stories, I think is important, because a year like 2020 can come along and change everything. Or a year could come along where everything gets completely upended, and now you're at the front of the pile because now you've got the positive experience instead of the negative experience. Now, how do you change? If you're stuck in a rut of what you were doing before, you can't adapt to the awesome new thing, then you're in trouble. So just kind of looking at the lay of the land to have, multiple plans, backup plans, I think is a positive thing to do as a storyteller.
Yeah, a personal example from my 2020 is that at the end of 2019, I wrote 3 short stories, prose short stories. And then in 2020, I wrote 7 and began a number of others.
Nice.
And the reason that I leaned more into that is because in a pandemic world where things like production and publishing are less certain, I still moved forward in both comics and film.
Right.
But I wanted to add to my portfolio something that I could just send straight to readers. I can directly connect stories to people, because if I find myself if I have something that goes into production as a comic series, but maybe it's going to take 2 years to come out, or the film that I had that came out this year, I wrote 3 years earlier. And in the midst of all of that, it's nice to have just things you can put into the world that people can interact with. And so that was why that number went up for me in 2020.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of thing that I think you don't need to be a producer to adapt to the marketplace. In fact, writers should always be thinking about who they're writing for, how those people are ingesting stories, why those people are ingesting stories, and how to make an impact in those people's lives, right? So knowing what's going on with your audience, I would probably write a story. Well, the sequel that we have to Death of a Bounty Hunter, I've started writing already. And it's for people who are struggling with polarization because guess what? this is the environment we find ourselves in. So I think that it's really important to do that. Before we jump into goal setting, which we will do, I did want to point out that you can check out 2020. Caleb released, he co-wrote a movie called the Mongolian Connection. I almost always want to call it the Mandalorian Connection just because it's just right. The two words are interspersed in my head. The Mongolian Connection, which is available on Amazon Prime right now. So if you have Amazon Prime, you don't even have to pay for it. It's like free. Just go watch it. But you can also rent it on some of the other platforms as well, including, I believe, iTunes and some of the others. I've seen it. I highly recommend it. It's a really cool film, and it shows you kind of. And by the way, you should watch it, and then you should go watch our conversation about it on this channel. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was Death of a Bounty Hunter. So Death of a Bounty Hunter is available as a novel. It's also available as an audiobook. The other thing I wanted to mention about Death of a Bounty Hunter, we were really, really excited about this. We got notified that it made the quarterfinals of Screencraft's cinematic book competition. And so we're very stoked about that. So go watch The Mongolian Connection. Go check out Death of a Bounty Hunter. You can go to deathofabountyhunter.com and check out, either you can get the novel or you can get the full cast audiobook there.